Well, Bryan Davis, I am so excited to have you on the Collide Kids podcast today.
All right, Kristen, it's great to be here.
Yes, thank you so much for doing this. And it's great that we get to talk about books because I love reading. Do you love reading? Is that like your
I
favorite thing?
do. I do.
Yeah. Has that always been a thing you've loved to do is to read?
No, it hasn't been. I started reading a lot when I had a job that required about an hour bus ride to and from work. So I started reading then, and I devoured a lot of books during that time.
Yeah, that'll do it, right? You're just sitting there, you can't do anything else. So you
Hmm.
get something in your
Yeah,
mind instead.
it was before smartphones, so there's no games I could be doing.
Right. You can't scroll on your social media or play Tetris or something.
Hmm.
Well, good. Well, would you just introduce yourself to our listeners today? Tell us a little bit about who you are and what you do.
Well, I've been a full-time author for a little over 20 years. I was a computer geek before that, for 20 years. Well, all of my kids are homeschooled. My wife and I have 7 kids, and they were all homeschooled. And they weren't excited about writing at all. So I started writing a story for them and with them to get their ideas for the story. And it grew into a full-length novel, and they ended up being good writers. So it worked really well. But that inspired a passion in me to write because I saw how powerful storytelling could be. Because as you
Mhm.
know, Jesus told stories, he taught that way. So I started trying to get the book published. I learned that I had a lot to learn. And over several years, I took classes on writing, read books on writing, and it took about 8 years to get my first book published. But as they say, the rest of the stories after that, it's all worked out well.
Yeah, for real. And we're getting to talk now because you did that. So that's
Yeah.
great. How many books have you written?
This one that's coming out in June is number 50.
50, like 50.
Yes.
Wow. Wow, that's a lot. That's great. Good. Well, I am excited to talk to you. But before we do that, before we get into your story, this is a podcast for kids. And so I always ask my guests to tell me a joke. So what have you got for us?
Why do Peruvian owls always hunt in pairs?
I don't know.
Because they're in cahoots.
They're Inca. Okay, that's good. I like it, and I do think you're the first person to ever tell a joke about an owl on the show.
Oh,
So
okay. Well, maybe I can
yeah.
think of another one.
Well, let's get started. I think this is so interesting. How did you get started as a writer? You said you started with your kids. And so, what was the next step after you realized, hey, we've got something here and I enjoy this? So, what do you do after that?
Well, as I said, the book grew into a full-length novel, and I started trying to get that published, and I got a lot of rejection notices. And I was still learning. About 2 years into that process, one night I had a dream about a boy who could breathe fire. And I thought it was a special dream. It felt unusual. So I told my oldest son about it, who was 13 years old at the time. He said, "Oh, Dad, that's a cool story. You should write a book about that boy who breathes fire because then it'd be a lot better than that other stuff you've been writing."
Thanks, son.
Thanks. Yeah, thanks, son. He has survived to he's 42 now.
Okay, good. He made it after
He
that day.
made it. But we brainstormed that story. How could a boy breathe fire? And he said his parents are dragons. And I said, well, how about if we say his parents used to be dragons and they got transformed into humans? And he said, how about if we say they got transformed in the time of King Arthur? So the story just grew with all this brainstorming.
Mhm.
And I wrote that story with his help because I didn't know much about fantasy back then, and he did. He was a voracious reader. I wrote that in about a year. I was a full-time computer guy back then,
Mhm.
and I started sending that out to publishers, and I got a lot of rejection notices. The problem was the secular publishers would say, "Well, it's just too Christian. We can't publish that." And the Christian publishers were saying, "Oh, it's just too weird. Dragons transforming into humans? What are you thinking?" So it took a long time. It finally this one publisher, little publisher, AMG in Chattanooga, Tennessee,
Mhm.
picked it up. It became a bestseller, and a much larger publisher bought the rights of Tyndale. And now there are. I just finished the 13th book in that story world. The Sacred
Okay.
Scales is number 13, so it's grown massively. and that's how it all started.
I love that, and I think that's so fun that you got to brainstorm a little bit and, like, work out the story with your kids so they
My
could.
kids and I still brainstorm for all my books.
Really?
It's a staple of preparation for a story.
That's great. Can you tell us a little bit about what that's like? Is it just like you put paper out on the table and everybody starts kind of writing stuff down, or is it just
It's
conversation?
all verbal.
Okay.
I've actually sat them down and said, "All right, everyone, come to the table. We're going to brainstorm," and they love doing it. They enjoy it because it sparks the imagination. And I remember one time in particular, we had a not very fruitful session. After we did it, my second born son came to my office
Mhm.
and said, "I had an idea, but I didn't want to tell anybody because it's just too weird." I said, "Oh, but I love weird. Tell me." And he told me, he said, "I had this idea about a boy in his bedroom, and he's got a trunk, like a big treasure chest trunk, and it's closed in his room. But when he looks in the mirror, the trunk is open." So, yeah, that's good. Go on. He said,
Uh-huh.
"That's all I got." So then we brainstormed from there, and that became my Time Echoes trilogy, and so it works really well.
That's great. I love that they're all a part of that. That's really cool. Do you give them credit in the book? Like, are they in the credits or anything like that?
No,
But
but
you're giving them
whenever
credit now.
but whenever I go to speak in places like this, I always tell that second-born son was Josiah, if he's listening. Hi,
Uh-huh.
Josiah. And the firstborn, James, I do give him credit verbally.
That's great. I love that. That's so cool that they get to be a part of that and just to have those creative ideas. Cause I think too, it's so fun to kind of think through a story like that with that. Have you ever played the game Story Cubes? Do you know about Story Cubes? So it's one of those where like you roll the dice or you roll these cubes and then like that spurs the next part of the story. And so it's really a game where you're just everyone in the group is working out a story together. So I feel like your family would really like that game.
That does sound very much like what we do.
Yeah, that's awesome. So your latest book is Sacred Scales. Can you tell us a little bit about that? Like, where did the inspiration come for this book?
Well, the Dragons in Our Midst with The Boy Who Could Breathe Fire, that grew into a 12-book story world, and it actually goes well into the future. It's contemporary, it's our world, our time, but then later books go well into the future.
Hmm.
And it's been 10 years since that final book came out. It was called Omega Dragon. And I thought the story was done because, I mean, we go to the end of the Bible with the rapture or whatever, and, apocalypse is all done. So I can't go any farther. But then I realized that there was a lot that took place back in the time of King Arthur when the dragons transformed into humans that I did not reveal in the story. Lots of questions left unanswered. So I decided to go back and do that. And I made two brand new human characters who are the catalysts for everything that happened. And it's been fun to solve all those mysteries that readers might have been wondering about. And I've already written all four books in that series.
Okay.
It has been real fun.
Now, is it one of those things where you're writing like when the first series, you're writing that series, the story comes together and you're like, "Ah, I really want to include more information about this, or is it just you just left it unanswered at the time and now you're going back?
Most of the questions didn't occur to me until after it was
Oh,
all written. After all 12 books were written, I was thinking about what could I write? Like I said, I can't go forward in the future, so I
right.
started pondering what was in the past. Well, I didn't account for this, and I didn't solve that mystery, and it just grew in my mind and said, "Oh, I could write a whole series on this." So,
Yeah. So I'm working on writing a book. It's not a fiction book, it's a nonfiction book, but I'm always interested to hear from authors what your writing process is like. Like what do you have to set aside a chunk of time or is it like when the story comes to you, you just have to sit down and get it out? How does that work for you with your writing?
well, I am what a lot of people call a seat of the pants writer, or pantser for short. Discovery writer is a nicer term. I sit down with just a character and a problem, and I just go. I start teaching myself about the character, what
Mhm.
he or she would do in their ordinary worlds, and then I present the problem. Some people call it a crisis point. then I destroy that ordinary world so that they can't exist in it anymore and they have to go on their journey. So I go on the journey with them, not knowing what's going to happen. I don't know the end. All I knew was that the ordinary world and then a problem is coming.
Okay.
And then I just flush it out as I go, learning as I write. As far as chunk of time, I'm a full-time author, so I can write all day, and that's if I'm not out marketing and promoting, that's what I do. I just write all day long.
Okay. So even if you're not writing for a specific book, you're just writing, or you are always thinking about the next book?
I'm always working in book, always.
Okay.
So my 50th book. This one is my 40th novel. That's a lot of writing.
Yeah, that is a lot. Wow. What has been your favorite book to read? Like, as far, I mean, obviously the Bible. We love the Bible. But other than the Bible, what is your favorite book, or what was the book that inspired you?
My top three, I'll tell you that. My first
Okay.
one, To Kill a Mockingbird.
Mm.
I love that book because the author's genius in being able to portray some very deep, complex issues through the eyes of a little girl. To be able to do that to me is fascinating and I learn from it because I have a lot of young characters. And to be able to show things that they might not even compute in their brains, not really
Mhm.
processing it, but showing what they say, showing what they do, and the adult readers are going, okay, I see what's going on here. So I love that.
Mhm.
My second one would be Mark Twain's version of Joan of Arc. Did you know that he wrote a book on Joan of Arc?
No, I didn't.
A lot of people don't know it, and it's his best work. And he said so himself. He said this is his best work. He spent 14 years in Europe researching that book, and it's just so beautiful. And you can see his wit in there, even though it's Joan of Arc.
Right.
My third is C.S. Lewis's Till We Have Faces.
Okay.
And I think what fascinates me is that all three books are very similar. They're all told in first person. They're all told from the perspective of somebody looking way back in the past. And they all have a major trial, like a court trial in the
Mhm.
book. And for some reason, the kind of dynamic really inspires me. In all three cases, there's a great amount of injustice in the trial.
Mhm.
People were found guilty and harshly punished for something that they really didn't do. So that led me to uh, have a big interest in mercy, forgiveness, reconciliation.
Mhm.
So one of my major themes throughout my stories will be mercy and forgiveness, and those three books really helped me get there.
I love that. I love that you tied those together. What are some things that you have learned about your relationship with God as you've been a writer all this time?
God's provision and His sufficiency has been huge. Uh, as a father of seven, always concerned about, am I going to make money or get the kids education and put shoes on all their feet and so forth.
Mhm.
And God taught me some amazing lessons on His sufficiency. You want to hear a story?
I'd love one. Yeah.
When Raising Dragons first came out, I also had another book called The Image of a Father, a nonfiction book on fathering. And my first foray into um, marketing it was at a Christian Booksellers Association convention. And their publishers would have all their books on display for the big time buyers who come in to
Mhm.
decide if they want to pick up your book. So they invited me to come and give away copies of both those books. And while I was there, I met the president of the publishing company. He was in a wheelchair. His name was Spiros Zodiades, Greek and Hebrew scholar. He was in a wheelchair because he had had a couple of strokes. And then he said, "Oh, my brother, it's good to meet you. Because I heard all about you, how you quit your job to pursue writing full time. I didn't mention that part, that you don't know where your next paycheck's coming from, but you trusted God to do this." And then he stopped and his eyes grew wide. He started clapping his hands. "Oh, my brother, I've been wondering why God has called me to this convention, and now I know. God wants me to give you a word. The word is autarkia. It's a Greek word. It means sufficiency. It means contentment. Those two are tied together. If you trust in God's sufficiency, you will learn contentment. God wants you to know that He will be your sufficiency no matter what. Just be content. And God wants you to put contentment as a theme in your next book. Oh, okay. Well, I had written the first two books in Dragons in Our Midst, and the third book, Circles of Seven, was just in my mind. And so I said, all right, I'll see what I can do. And I did, and it worked out beautifully. But anyway, after that convention, I was trying to think about the best way to market my books. And since I'm a homeschool dad, I thought maybe homeschool conventions would be the way to do it. So I said, Lord, if you want me to do this, help me to at least break even or maybe make a profit. That'll help me to know if this is what I should be doing. And if not, then I'll seek something else. Sort of like Gideon throwing the fleece out. Is this going to work? So I took one of my daughters with me, and we went to this convention in Alabama and rented the table, and I was keeping really close track of my expenses. And this was a very conservative homeschool convention. So I wasn't getting a lot of sales for this weird dragons book, as you might imagine. But I kept track. It was a 2-day convention. Every hour, I would calculate. All right, I know how much money I'm making on each sale. And I know how many hours in the convention. And I have a math brain, so I would extrapolate and figure out, okay, how much am I going to make? Well, after the first hour, I calculated that I was going to be $50 short of breaking even. And these two girls kept coming by my sales table. One was severely handicapped in a wheelchair, and the other was also handicapped, but she was able to walk. She had feet turned in and her hands were clubbed, but they would stop by and look at my books. We're both 10 years old. We're best friends. Can we look at your books? They were just the cutest girls. And the girl in the wheelchair reminded me of Dr. Zodiades in his wheelchair. This little girl, she's probably had so many surgeries. She can't go out and play with the other kids. Uh, so she has lots of reasons to be sad and depressed, but she has this beautiful smile and she's so friendly. She was reminding me of that word, autarkia, contentment. So I was wondering, is God giving me an illustration of that word? So they'd go on their way and I would keep calculating every hour, and every hour I'd come up with the same answer. I'm going to be $50 short of breaking even. So when we get to the final few minutes of the convention, there's this guy looking at my fathering book. And my daughter and I were putting all the books away, getting ready to go. And finally he said, this would be good for my men's ministry. I'll buy it. So he gave me the money. And I looked at the money and I said, this is the last money I'm going to get. Let me do another quick calculation. And yep, I'm going to be $50 short of breaking even. So I put it in the money box, said, well, I guess I'll be finding other ways to market the books. And as the man was walking away, he stopped, looked at the fathering book as if for the first time, and he said, Bryan Davis wrote this book. I said, yes. And he
That's me.
turned around and he saw the sign on the wall, Bryan Davis, author. He said, are you Bryan Davis? I said, yes. Then he started shaking and his face turned red. And he said, you're going to think this is really weird. I said, it's okay. What is it? He took out his wallet again and said, on my way over here, God told me to find a man named Bryan and to give him $50.
Wow.
I was so stunned. I said something dumb like, I don't know what to do. And he said, God told me to give this to you. Will you take it?
Wow.
So I did. And when I got home, I had to see, I put out all my receipts on the table, all the money I made. I broke even exactly to the dollar.
Wow.
So God was telling me, I own the cattle of 1,000 hills. Why are you sweating $50? I called you to do this. You go out,
That's right.
you cast your bread upon the water,
Yeah.
and it will come back to you. I'll take care of you. I am your sufficiency.
Wow.
That was a huge lesson.
Yeah, I love that story. That's incredible. And I love hearing stories about how people just feel this compelled to do something. Sometimes it's really weird. Like, I know there's been moments where God's asked me to do something, and I'm like, I have to go say this to someone or give something to someone. And you never know how much that's going to mean to that person or how God's going to use that small gift or that small word to
And
help
think of the
someone
faith
else.
of that guy who came in.
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
really have to do this now?
I know, and he's like, like how he just randomly found your book and then realized what God was telling him to do. So, thank you for sharing that story. I love that story. And I love that the way that God uses the things that he's called us to help us grow in our faith. And so God used that to grow your faith in
Absolutely.
many so I teach in my children's ministry. I get to do the Bible lessons sometimes. And a couple weeks ago, I taught the story of the woman, the widow who had just a little bit of oil, and the prophet Elisha came to her and she asked for help. Like, can you just help me and my sons? Because she was going to have to sell them into slavery because she had to pay off a debt. So she had this past debt. She just wanted a little bit of money so that she could get by. And God did a miracle in her midst, right? So I'm telling the story about how God provided for her, but the oil would pour out into all these containers, and she had so much oil that when she was able to sell it, not only did it take care of her past debt, it also took care of her present and her future. And so it convicted me when I was telling the kids the story. I was thinking about how often I don't pray. I don't trust God. I trust him. My prayers are so small and I trust God with the little, but he's like you just said, he's able to do so much more, and he owns the cattle on a thousand hills and he can provide for us. I love that you shared that because I'm still thinking about that story and how God's teaching me about his sufficiency. And then you shared that to me today. So that was an encouragement to my heart as well. Why do you think it's so important that we tell stories? Like you said that earlier that storytelling was important to Jesus. So why is that important for us to keep doing that today?
I think because stories are memorable. You could teach an academic lesson and give, like a pastor, he gives 3 points and tells you about the Greek. But if he's smart, he'll tell a story that illustrates the lesson. And when you get home, what do you remember? It's a story.
Right.
And if you remember the story, you'll remember the lesson behind the story. And I think Jesus knew that we're wired that way. We're
Mhm.
wired to remember stories. So the stories stick, and therefore the lesson sticks. If you didn't have the story, the lesson might not have stuck. The stories are more personal than an academic lesson. They hit the heart more. The heart
Mhm.
absorbs it more.
What would be your encouragement to someone out there? Maybe there's a kid or maybe there's a parent who's listening today and they want to be a writer or they're interested in being a writer. What encouragement would you give them?
Well, the encouragement I give is that I'm a person who had no idea how to do it, and if God is calling you to do it, then there's nothing that's going to stop you as long as you do the work that He calls you to do. It took a lot of work. I
Mhm.
studied hard. I read books. I went to conferences. I had a critique group. I was willing to do the work. So if God calls you, that means He knows that your heart and that you are willing. So if you're
Mhm.
willing, find the avenues to do it. I recommend writing conferences because there you will meet professional authors, editors who can review your work and let you know what you need to do better or what good things you are doing. There are conferences out there that will take young writers. They have teen tracks. I taught at a teen track at a writers conference for over 10 years. That's probably, I would say, is the best way to learn to be a writer. Get with other writers that
Mhm.
you can share with and brainstorm and figure out a path to go on.
Yeah. Do you loan out your family to help with brainstorming for other authors? Because it sounds like you have a great setup.
I Nobody's asked for that yet, but I brainstorm with people myself,
Okay.
and
That's
sometimes
good.
teach them how to brainstorm
Yeah.
so they can do it with their friends. That's one good thing about critique groups.
Yeah.
There, I used to meet with people once a month in a critique group, fellow writers. A lot of people now have online critique groups. I'll give you one for example. If you write fantasy, sci-fi, what we call speculative fiction, there's a group called Realm Makers,
Mhm.
REALM, Realm Makers.
Mhm.
And you can look them up. They have a convention, they have critique groups. It's a great resource for young writers.
That's really cool. I love that. There's so many things, like you said, online today. So there's lots of options out there. Well, Brian, this has been so great talking with you. Thank you so much for being on the show and sharing about your book. Now, it comes out June 3rd, Sacred Scales.
Mhm.
And is this the first or second book in the
It's the
series?
first book in a new series called Dragons of Camelot, because we're going
Okay.
back to the time of King Arthur and Camelot.
Right. And then you said the next four books are coming too.
There will be 4 books in the series. So the
Okay.
Sacred Scales is number 1. There will be 3 more.
Awesome. That's exciting. Well, if you're a person who likes to read series or you like to, know what happens at the end of a book, then definitely get into this series. I think you'll enjoy it. Well, thank you so much for doing this today. Before I let you go, I always ask my guests to tell me a memory from when they were a kid. So, do you have a memory you want to share?
One I've been thinking about is how God used my mother to teach me about God's always watching over me. I
Mhm.
went to a school basketball game one night, and I was taken there by somebody else, not my mother, but she knew where I was going.
Mhm.
And for some reason, the person who took me there left, and I didn't have a way to get home. And so I was at the school, and everybody was gone, and I was alone. So as a kid, what do you do? I said, well, my mom will find me. She will be here. So all I had to do was wait, and she showed up. And that teacher taught me about God. He is much more powerful and much more loving than even my mom.
Mhm.
And if I wait on the Lord, he'll show up. He always does.
Good. I love that. And good on your mom. She was coming. She's on her way. That's what they need to know. That's what kids need to remember. Well, thank you so much again, Brian, for being on the show. Where can our listeners find you and learn more about your books?
Well, my website is daviscrossing.com, Davis, my last name, crossing, crossing.com. And that'll have links to where all my other stuff, my Facebook page and so forth. And you can find everything about me there. I have a blog, I have a way to buy books, and so it's all there.
Great. Well, thank you so much for being on the show.